The blood on her hands had dried, hours ago, but Willa Voss could still feel its phantom weight as she stumbled through the night toward the flickering lights of Pendleton, Oregon, her bare feet torn and bleeding from 3 days of walking through rocky terrain. She had killed a man in self-defense back in Idaho territory, watched him fall after he tried to force himself on her in the barn where she'd been sleeping, and she knew his brothers would be hunting her now. So she ran with nothing but the ragged dress on her back and a desperate prayer that somewhere in this world there existed a place she might finally be safe. The year was 1883, and Pendleton sprawled along the Umatilla River like a promise she wasn't sure she could believe in. The town had grown prosperous on wheat and wool, its streets busy even at this late hour with cattlemen and sheep herders, merchants, and railroad workers. Willa kept to the shadows, her long, dark hair hanging in tangled waves around her face, her green eyes darting nervously at every sound. She was 19 years old and had never known a single day of peace in her entire life. Her mother had died giving birth to her in a covered wagon somewhere on the Oregon Trail. Her father had blamed her for that death every day until he'd drunk himself into the grave when she was 12. After that, she'd been passed from one homestead to another, working for her keep, sleeping in barns and root cellars, and once, memorably, in a chicken coop for an entire winter. She'd never owned a pair of shoes that fit. She'd never had a dress that wasn't handed down and patched a dozen times. And she'd never, not once in her 19 years, slept in a real bed. The thought seemed absurd now, as she pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of a saloon, trying to catch her breath. Through the swinging doors she could hear piano music and laughter, the clink of glasses and the low rumble of men's voices. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, when she'd stolen 2 eggs from a farmhouse and swallowed them raw while running. "You lost, girl?" Willa spun around, her heart hammering, and found herself face to face with a woman in a purple dress that exposed more skin than Willa had ever dared show. The woman's face was painted, her lips bright red, but her eyes held something that might have been kindness. "I'm just passing through," Willa managed, her voice hoarse from thirst. The woman looked her up and down, taking in the torn dress, the bloody feet, the haunted expression. "When's the last time you ate?" Willa didn't answer. She'd learned long ago that charity always came with a price, and she had nothing left to pay with. "Come on," the woman said, reaching for Willa's arm. "Let me get you something from the kitchen. No strings. I remember what it's like to be that hungry." But before Willa could respond, a commotion erupted from inside the saloon. The doors burst open and 2 men came tumbling out, fists flying, crashing into the dirt street. A crowd quickly gathered, shouting encouragement and placing bets. Willa tried to back away, but the woman had already disappeared inside, and the growing crowd pressed in around her, trapping her. One of the fighting men was huge, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, his face already swelling from the blows. The other was leaner, taller, moving with a controlled grace that spoke of real skill rather than brute strength. He wore a dusty brown hat, dark pants, and a shirt that might have been blue before the trail dirt got to it. As Willa watched, he dodged a wild swing and delivered a precise uppercut that sent the big man staggering backward. "That's enough, Garrett!" someone shouted from the crowd. "You've made your point!" But the big man wasn't finished. He charged forward with a roar, and the leaner man, this Garrett apparently, sidestepped and used the momentum to send his opponent crashing face first into a water trough. The big man came up sputtering and then stayed down, defeated. Garrett straightened, breathing hard, and pushed his hat back from his forehead. That was when Willa saw his face clearly for the first time. He was young, maybe 25, with strong features and dark eyes that held neither cruelty nor arrogance, just a weary sort of resignation. Blood trickled from a cut above his eyebrow, but he didn't seem to notice. "Anybody else want to accuse me of cheating?" he asked the crowd, his voice carrying easily in the night air. The silence that followed was answer enough. The crowd began to disperse, and Garrett bent to retrieve his hat from where it had fallen. As he straightened, his gaze swept across the remaining onlookers and stopped on Willa. Their eyes met for just a moment, but something in that brief connection made Willa's breath catch. She saw recognition there, not of her specifically, but of what she was. Alone, frightened, running. He looked away first, settling his hat back on his head, and moved toward the hitching post, where a bay horse waited patiently. Willa knew she should keep walking, find somewhere to hide for the night, but her legs felt suddenly weak and the world tilted dangerously. She hadn't realized how close to collapse she was until that moment. The street rushed up to meet her, and the last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was someone shouting for help. When consciousness returned, it came slowly, accompanied by the feeling of something cool and wet on her forehead. Willa's eyes fluttered open to find herself lying on a bed, an actual bed with a real mattress and clean sheets, in a small room lit by a single oil lamp. She jerked upright immediately, panic flooding through her. "Easy," a male voice said, and Garrett stepped into her line of vision, holding a damp cloth. "You fainted in the street. I brought you to my room at the boarding house." Willa scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the wall, her heart racing. "I don't have any money. I can't pay you." Something that might have been pain flashed across Garrett's face. "I'm not asking for payment. You collapsed. I helped. That's all." She stared at him, trying to read deception in his features and finding none. He stood near the door, as if deliberately keeping his distance, his hat now hanging on a peg on the wall. Without it, she could see that his hair was dark brown, slightly too long, curling at his collar. The cut above his eyebrow had been cleaned but was still visible. "I brought some water and bread," he said, gesturing to a small table beside the bed. "You look like you could use both." Willa's gaze went to the table, and her stomach clenched at the sight of food. A pitcher of water sat beside a plate holding thick slices of bread and what looked like cheese. She wanted to maintain her wariness, her distrust, but hunger won out. She reached for the water first, gulping it down so fast that some spilled down her chin. "Slow down," Garrett said gently. "You'll make yourself sick." She forced herself to pause, to breathe, and then took another drink more carefully. The water was cool and clean, the best thing she'd tasted in days. When she finally lowered the cup, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded and moved toward a pile of blankets on the floor near the window. It was only then that Willa realized what he'd done. This was his room, his bed, and he'd given it to her while he prepared to sleep on the hard wooden floor. "Wait," she said. "This is your bed." "I know. You don't have to sleep on the floor. I can't take your bed." Garrett looked at her, and in the lamplight his dark eyes were surprisingly warm. "When's the last time you slept in a real bed?" The question was so unexpected, so specific, that Willa found herself answering honestly. "Never." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of quiet determination settling over his features. "Then you're sleeping in this one tonight. No arguments. But I'm a stranger. You don't owe me anything." "I know that too." He arranged the blankets into a makeshift pallet, moving with practiced efficiency. "But my mother raised me to believe that kindness isn't about what you're owed. It's about what's right." Willa didn't know what to say to that. She'd met plenty of men in her 19 years, and exactly none of them had given up their comfort for hers without expecting something in return. She watched as Garrett settled himself on the floor, using his saddle as a pillow, and realized that he genuinely didn't intend to ask her for anything. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment. "Willa Voss." "Garrett Xerxes," he said. "My friends call me Garrett. Most people just call me that card sharp who got into a fight tonight, but I prefer Garrett." Despite everything, Willa felt the smallest hint of a smile tug at her lips. "You play cards?" "When I need the money. I'm actually a horse trader by profession, but the market's been slow lately." He shifted on his pallet, trying to find a comfortable position. "What brings you to Pendleton, Miss Voss?" The smile disappeared. "I'm running from some men who want to hurt me. I didn't do anything wrong, but they won't care about that." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "The blood on your dress, is that yours?" Willa looked down and saw the dark stains she'd almost forgotten about. "No. It's from the man I killed. He tried to force himself on me in a barn where I was sleeping. I fought back. He fell and hit his head on a plow blade. His brothers will be looking for revenge." She waited for Garrett to tell her to leave, to get out of his room before she brought trouble to his door. Instead, he said, "Then we'll make sure they don't find you." "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "I know enough." He pillowed his head on his arms, looking up at the ceiling. "I know you've been hurt and scared and running. I know you've never slept in a real bed, which tells me you've been working hard your whole life and never getting much in return. I know you defended yourself against a man who would have hurt you, and that makes you brave, not criminal. That's enough for me." Willa felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked away for so long she'd forgotten it existed. It felt dangerously close to hope. "I don't understand you, Garrett Xerxes." "That's all right. You don't have to understand me tonight. Just get some sleep. We can figure out the rest in the morning." She wanted to argue, to maintain the walls she'd built around herself for protection, but exhaustion was pulling at her like an undertow. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she'd ever experienced, the pillow clean and smelling faintly of soap. Her body ached in a dozen places, and her feet throbbed with every heartbeat. "I'm going to blow out the lamp now," Garrett said. "Is that all right?" The fact that he asked, that he gave her warning and choice, made that crack in her chest widen a little more. "Yes." Darkness filled the room as he extinguished the flame. Willa lay very still, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around them, the distant noise from the saloons, the creak of floorboards as someone walked down the hall. She could hear Garrett's breathing, steady and even, from his place on the floor. "Garrett," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes?" "Thank you, for the bed, for everything." "You're welcome, Willa Voss. Now get some sleep." She closed her eyes and, for the first time in 3 days, felt safe enough to let unconsciousness claim her. Her last thought before sleep took her was that Garrett Xerxes was either the kindest man she'd ever met or the best liar, and she prayed with everything she had left that it was the former. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from somewhere below. Willa woke slowly, disoriented by the softness beneath her and the absence of cold or discomfort. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, and panic spiked through her. Then memory returned, and she sat up to find Garrett already awake, sitting on the floor near the window, with his back against the wall. "Morning," he said, and his voice was rough with sleep. "There's a wash basin on the dresser if you want to clean up. I'll head downstairs and get us some breakfast." Willa watched as he stood, stretching carefully, and saw him wince. "You're sore from sleeping on the floor." "I'll survive." He grabbed his hat from the peg. "Do you have any other clothes?" She shook her head. "Just what I'm wearing." Garrett studied her torn, blood-stained dress for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "All right, stay here and rest. I'll be back soon." He left before she could respond, closing the door quietly behind him. Willa sat in the bed for a long moment, trying to process the strangeness of her situation. Then she forced herself to move, to take advantage of the wash basin and the small sliver of soap sitting beside it. The water was cold, but she didn't care. She scrubbed the trail dirt from her hands and face, worked her fingers through the tangled mess of her hair, and tried to make herself presentable. Her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser was startling. She looked half wild, her green eyes too large in her thin face, her cheekbones sharp from weeks of irregular meals. The dress was beyond saving, torn at the shoulder and stained dark in places. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman with nowhere to go and nothing to her name. A knock at the door made her jump. "It's me!" Garrett's voice came through the wood. Willa opened the door to find him holding a tray with 2 plates of eggs and bacon, 2 cups of coffee, and a bundle wrapped in brown paper tucked under his arm. He stepped inside and set the tray on the small table, then handed her the bundle. "I stopped by the general store," he said. "It's not much, but it should fit well enough." Willa unwrapped the paper with trembling fingers and found a simple calico dress in dark blue, a clean chemise, and a pair of practical leather shoes. The lump in her throat made it hard to speak. "I can't accept this. I have no way to pay you back." "I'm not asking you to pay me back." "But why? Why are you doing this?" Garrett poured coffee into both cups, his movements deliberate. "My sister was about your age when she died. Pneumonia took her 2 winters ago. Before she got sick, she was traveling with a family heading west, working as their help. They treated her poorly, made her sleep in their wagon, barely fed her. By the time she made it home to us, she was already sick. She died in my arms telling me she was sorry for being a burden." He stopped, his jaw tight, and Willa saw the grief still raw in his eyes. "I couldn't help her, but I can help you, so please, just let me do this." Willa clutched the dress to her chest, feeling tears prick at her eyes for the first time in years. She'd learned not to cry, because tears never changed anything, but standing here in this small room, with this stranger who was showing her more kindness than she'd known in her lifetime, she felt that old defense crumbling. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said softly. "So am I." He cleared his throat and gestured to the food. Eat something, then we need to talk about what comes next." She changed behind a screen in the corner, her fingers clumsy with the buttons of the new dress. The fabric was soft and clean, and the shoes, while not perfect, were better than anything she'd ever worn. When she emerged, she found Garrett waiting patiently, his own breakfast untouched. They ate in companionable silence, and Willa had to force herself to eat slowly despite her hunger. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the bacon crisp, and the coffee strong enough to make her feel more alert than she had in days. When she finally set down her fork, Garrett refilled her coffee cup and leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about these men who are after you," he said. Willa wrapped her hands around the warm cup, gathering her thoughts. "The man I killed was named Jacob Brennan. He had 3 brothers, all of them mean as rattlesnakes. They run a ranch up in Idaho territory and they think they own everything and everyone around them. When I was working at a neighboring farm, Jacob started coming around, making comments, trying to corner me. I avoided him as best I could, but 3 nights ago, he found me in the barn where I was sleeping." She paused, the memory making her skin crawl. "He grabbed me, tore my dress, said I'd been leading him on and it was time I paid up. I fought him off, grabbed a pitchfork, and when he came at me again, I swung it. He dodged, but he stumbled backward and fell, hit his head on the blade of a plow that was leaning against the wall. There was so much blood." Garrett's expression had gone hard, his jaw clenched. "You did what you had to do. I know that, but his brothers won't see it that way. They'll paint me as a murderer, and no sheriff in Idaho territory will take my word over theirs. So I ran." She met his eyes across the table. "I've been running for 3 days. I don't know if they're still following me, but I can't risk stopping." "Then don't stop," Garrett said. "Keep moving, but maybe not alone." Willa's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm heading to California to meet with a rancher who's interested in buying some horses. It's a long trip and I could use the company. If you wanted to come along, you'd have protection and a destination. Once we get to California, you'd be far enough from Idaho that the Brennan brothers would have a hell of a time finding you." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Willa couldn't quite process it. "You want me to travel with you, all the way to California? If you want to, no pressure, but it seems like a solution that might benefit us both. How would traveling with me benefit you?" Garrett smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more relaxed. "Like I said, I could use the company, and honestly, a woman traveling with me makes the journey less suspicious. People will assume we're married or family. It'll attract less attention than a man traveling alone." Willa knew she should be more cautious, should question his motives more deeply, but something in her gut told her that Garrett Xerxes was exactly what he appeared to be. A good man trying to do right by someone who needed help, and she needed help desperately. "All right," she said. "I'll come with you to California." "Good." Garrett stood and collected their empty plates. "We'll leave first thing tomorrow morning. That'll give us today to gather supplies and for you to rest properly. Your feet need time to heal before we hit the trail." "I can work," Willa said quickly. "To earn my keep. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm good with horses too." "I don't doubt it, but today just rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough." He left her alone in the room for most of the day, bringing her lunch and dinner, but otherwise giving her space. Willa spent the time alternating between sleeping, sitting by the window, watching the busy street below, and trying to convince herself that this wasn't a dream that would evaporate when she woke. The bed remained soft, the dress remained clean, and when Garrett returned that evening with supplies for their journey, he remained kind. That night, he took the floor again without complaint, despite Willa's protests. She lay awake for a long time, listening to his breathing, marveling at the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. She'd killed a man, run for her life, and collapsed in a dusty Oregon town, only to be saved by a stranger with dark eyes and a gentle voice who asked for nothing in return. "Garrett," she whispered into the darkness, just like the night before. "Yes? I'll work hard on this trip. I'll pull my weight, I promise." "I know you will, Willa. Now get some sleep. We've got a long road ahead of us." She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, and for the second night in a row, she felt safe. They left Pendleton just after dawn, heading southwest on horses Garrett had apparently owned for years. His bay gelding was named Rusty, and he'd borrowed a gentle mare called Daisy for Willa to ride. The morning was cool and clear, the air smelling of sage and dust. And as the town disappeared behind them, Willa felt both terrified and exhilarated. Garrett set an easy pace, clearly mindful of the fact that Willa wasn't an experienced rider. She'd been on horses before, but never for long distances, and never on a journey like this. He answered her questions patiently, pointed out landmarks, and told her stories about his work as a horse trader that made her laugh despite her nervousness. They stopped frequently to rest the horses and stretch their legs. During one of these stops, as they sat beside a creek letting the horses drink, Garrett asked, "What do you want to do once we get to California?" Willa had been so focused on simply surviving that she hadn't thought much about the future. "I don't know. Find work, I suppose. Maybe as a cook or a housekeeper." "You mentioned you're good with horses." "I am. I've helped birth foals, broken colts to saddle, nursed sick horses back to health. I worked on a horse ranch for 2 years before the family moved back east and left me behind." Garrett looked at her with new interest. "That's valuable experience. The rancher I'm meeting in California is always looking for good hands. If you wanted, I could put in a word for you." "You'd do that?" "Why wouldn't I?" Willa shook her head, still struggling to understand him. "Most people don't go out of their way to help someone they barely know." "Then you've been meeting the wrong people." Garrett stood and offered her his hand to help her up. His grip was strong and warm, and when she was on her feet, he didn't let go immediately. "I believe people are supposed to help each other, Willa. That's how the world's supposed to work. Just because it doesn't always work that way doesn't mean we should stop trying." She looked up at him, at his honest face and steady eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't quite attraction, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, a seed planted in soil that had been barren for too long. They rode until dusk, making camp beside a stand of juniper trees. Garrett showed Willa how to hobble the horses properly and helped her build a fire. They ate beans and hardtack, which tasted better than it should have, simply because she wasn't eating alone and afraid. When darkness fell, Garrett spread out their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance. "Tell me about your family," Willa said, as they sat watching the flames dance. Garrett was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "My parents have a small ranch outside of Walla Walla, Washington. My father breeds horses, and my mother keeps the books and runs the household. I have 2 older brothers, both married with children, and I had my younger sister Emma, who I told you about." "You said she died in your arms." "She did." His voice was heavy with old grief. "She was 20 years old and so full of life. She wanted to see the world, have adventures. That's why she took the job with that family heading west. She thought it would be exciting. Instead, they worked her half to death and treated her like she was worthless. By the time she came home, she was a shadow of herself." "I'm sorry," Willa said softly. "Me too. I think about her every day, about what I could have done differently, how I could have protected her better. You can't protect someone who doesn't want to be protected. Sometimes people need to make their own choices, even if those choices lead to hard places." Garrett looked at her across the fire, his expression thoughtful. "That's wise for someone so young. I'm not that young. I'm 19. And I'm 24, still young enough to make mistakes and old enough to know better." He smiled slightly. "What about your family? You mentioned your parents are both gone." Willa drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "My mother died giving birth to me. My father blamed me for her death and made sure I knew it every day. When he died, I was 12 and alone. I've been working for my keep ever since, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. That must have been lonely." "It was. It is." She stared into the fire, watching the embers glow. "I used to dream about having a real home, a place where I belonged. Silly, I know. It's not silly at all. Everyone wants to belong somewhere." "Do you? Belong somewhere, I mean?" Garrett considered this. "I belong with my family, I suppose, but I've never felt settled there, if that makes sense. My brothers are content to work the ranch and raise their families, but I've always wanted something more. I just don't know what that more is yet." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled and popped, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. Willa felt the exhaustion of the day settling into her bones, but she didn't want to sleep yet. She wanted to stay here, in this moment, sitting across from someone who actually listened when she spoke. "Garrett," she said after a while. "Yes? Thank you for everything. For the bed, the clothes, this journey. I know I keep saying it, but I mean it. I know you do." He stood and stretched, then added more wood to the fire. "Get some sleep, Willa. Tomorrow's another long day." She settled into her bedroll, the ground hard beneath her but the blankets warm, and watched as Garrett did the same on the other side of the fire. The stars overhead were brilliant, uncountable, and she fell asleep counting them like sheep. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. They rode from dawn until dusk, stopping to rest and water the horses, making camp each night in whatever sheltered spot they could find. Garrett proved to be an easy traveling companion, patient with her inexperience and willing to teach her the skills she lacked. He showed her how to read the land, how to find water, how to tell if a storm was coming by the look of the sky. In return, Willa made herself useful in whatever ways she could. She cooked their meals, mended a tear in Garrett's shirt, and took care of the horses with a practiced hand that clearly impressed him. She told him stories about the places she'd worked and the people she'd met, and he listened with genuine interest, asking questions and laughing at the funny parts. As the days passed, Willa found herself relaxing in ways she never had before. The constant fear that had been her companion for years began to fade, replaced by something that felt almost like contentment. She caught herself watching Garrett when he didn't notice, admiring the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he spoke to the horses. It was on the 5th day of their journey, as they followed a narrow trail through pine forest, that Garrett suddenly held up his hand in a signal to stop. Willa reined in Daisy, her heart jumping with sudden anxiety. "What is it?" she whispered. Garrett's face was tense, his body alert. "Riders, coming from behind us, 3, maybe 4 horses." Fear slammed into Willa like a physical blow. The Brennan brothers. Maybe, we don't know for sure. Garrett's mind was clearly racing, calculating options. "There's a canyon up ahead with a lot of rocky outcroppings. If we can make it there, we'll have places to hide." They urged their horses forward at a faster pace, Willa's hands trembling on the reins. Behind them, she could hear the sound of hoofbeats growing louder, closer. Her mind filled with images of Jacob Brennan's blood-soaked body, his brothers' faces twisted with rage and grief. The canyon opened up before them, all red rock and steep walls, and Garrett led them into a narrow side passage partially hidden by scrub brush. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses deeper into the rocky maze until they found a space large enough to conceal both animals and riders. "Stay quiet," Garrett whispered, his hand on Rusty's neck to keep the horse calm. They waited in tense silence, and a moment later, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Willa held her breath, pressing herself against the rock wall. Through a gap in the brush, she could see 4 men ride past, their faces hard and determined. She recognized 2 of them immediately, Matthew and Luke Brennan, Jacob's older brothers. "She came through here," one of them said, his voice carrying in the still air. "I can feel it." "We don't even know if she came this direction," another voice argued. "She could have gone anywhere. She headed south. The farmhand who saw her leave said she was heading for Oregon. We'll find her, and when we do, she'll pay for what she did to Jacob." The voices faded as the riders continued down the main canyon, and Willa felt Garrett's hand gently touch her shoulder. She realized she was shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "They're gone," Garrett said softly. "We're safe. For now, but they're not going to stop looking. Then we'll stay ahead of them." His hand moved from her shoulder to her face, turning her gently so she had to look at him. "I won't let them hurt you, Willa. I promise." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that promise, but she'd learned long ago that promises were fragile things, easily broken. Still, looking into Garrett's steady dark eyes, she found herself nodding. They stayed hidden for another hour, making sure the Brennan brothers were truly gone before venturing back out. When they finally continued their journey, Garrett altered their route, taking them through rougher terrain that would be harder to track. It made for slower going, but Willa was grateful for his caution. That night, they made a cold camp with no fire, not wanting to risk the light giving away their position. They ate dried meat and hardtack in silence, both of them on edge, jumping at every sound. When it was time to sleep, Garrett positioned himself between Willa and the direction the Brennan brothers had gone, his rifle within easy reach. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll keep watch. You can't stay awake all night." I'll wake you in a few hours and you can take a turn. But for now, try to sleep." Willa lay down in her bedroll, but found sleep elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jacob Brennan falling, saw the blood spreading across the barn floor. She'd told herself over and over that she'd had no choice, that it was him or her. But that knowledge didn't make the memory any easier to bear. "Willa?" Garrett's voice came softly through the darkness. "I'm awake. Are you all right?" "No, yes, I don't know." She sat up, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders. "I can't stop seeing it. His face when he fell, the way his brothers looked riding past us today." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Killing someone, even in self-defense, it changes you. It's not something you just get over. Have you ever killed anyone?" "Once, a few years ago. A man tried to rob me on the road, pulled a gun. I was faster. It was him or me, just like with you and Jacob Brennan." He paused. "I still think about it sometimes. Wonder if there was another way, even though I know there wasn't." Knowing that Garrett understood, that he carried a similar burden, made Willa feel less alone. She moved her bedroll closer to where he sat, seeking the comfort of proximity without quite knowing how to ask for it. "Can I sit with you for a while?" she asked. "Of course." She settled beside him, their shoulders nearly touching, and together they watched the darkness. The night was cool, the sky full of stars, and slowly Willa felt some of the tension leave her body. Garrett's presence was solid and reassuring, and she realized with a start that she was beginning to trust him in a way she'd never trusted anyone before. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked after a while. "And don't say it's just because of your sister. There has to be more to it." Garrett was silent for so long that Willa thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I think maybe I needed to do something good, something that mattered. I've spent the last 2 years drifting, working just enough to get by, never committing to anything or anyone. When I saw you collapse in that street, it felt like the universe was giving me a chance to be better than I've been." "You think I'm your chance at redemption?" "No, I think you're a person who deserved help, and I was in a position to give it. If that helps me feel less lost in the process, that's just a side benefit." Willa turned to look at him, really look at him, in the pale starlight. His profile was strong and clean, his expression thoughtful, and she felt something warm unfurl in her chest. It was attraction, yes, but it was also something deeper, something that scared her with its intensity. "I'm glad it was you who found me," she said quietly. Garrett turned his head, meeting her eyes, and for a moment the air between them felt charged with possibility. Then he smiled, gentle and a little sad, and said, "So am I." They sat together in companionable silence until Willa's eyelids grew heavy, and Garrett gently urged her back to her bedroll. This time, sleep came more easily, and her dreams were less troubled than they had been in days. The next morning brought clear skies and the need to keep moving. They stayed off the main trails, following deer paths and old game routes that Garrett seemed to know instinctively. Willa found herself impressed by his knowledge of the land, the way he could read signs in the dirt and plants that were invisible to her untrained eye. Around midday, they came across a small homestead nestled in a valley. Smoke rose from the chimney, and chickens pecked in the yard. Garrett suggested they stop to water the horses and maybe trade for some fresh provisions. The woman who answered their knock was middle-aged and weathered, with kind eyes and flour on her hands. Her husband appeared a moment later, suspicious until Garrett explained they were just passing through and hoping to buy some eggs and bread. "We don't get many travelers through here," the woman said, eyeing them with curiosity. "Where are you folks headed?" "California," Garrett said easily. "Taking my wife to meet my business partner there." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Willa almost believed it herself. The woman's expression softened immediately, and she insisted on inviting them in for coffee and fresh biscuits. Her husband, mollified by Garrett's friendly manner and the coins he offered for provisions, settled into conversation about horses and the best routes through the mountains. Willa sat at the worn kitchen table, cradling a cup of coffee and listening to the easy flow of conversation. The woman, whose name was Martha, peppered her with questions about where they'd come from and how long they'd been married. Willa answered vaguely, sticking close to the truth where she could, and letting Garrett fill in the gaps when necessary. "You're lucky to have such a considerate husband," Martha said at one point. "A man who takes care of his wife the way your Garrett clearly takes care of you. That's a rare thing." Willa felt heat rise to her cheeks. Yes, I'm very fortunate. She glanced at Garrett and found him watching her with an unreadable expression. When their eyes met, something passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of the lie they were maintaining and the strange truth underneath it. They left the homestead an hour later with fresh supplies and detailed directions for avoiding the roughest terrain ahead. As soon as they were out of earshot, Willa said, "Your wife?" Garrett had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. It was easier than explaining the real situation. People tend to ask fewer questions if they think we're married. I suppose that makes sense. I should have warned you before we got there. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot. It's all right. You handled it well. Willa urged Daisy forward, falling into step beside Rusty. You're a good liar. I prefer to think of it as being good at improvisation. Despite the tension of the past few days, Willa found herself laughing. It felt good, that release of tension, and she saw Garrett's expression lighten in response. They rode through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing from pine forest to more open country dotted with sagebrush and juniper. The mountains rose to their left, still snow-capped despite the summer heat, and hawks circled overhead on thermal currents. That evening, they made camp beside a creek, and Garrett declared it safe enough for a small fire. Willa cooked the eggs Martha had given them, scrambling them in a pan with some wild onions she'd found growing near the water. They ate as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for a little while, it was possible to forget about the men chasing them. Tell me about California, Willa said, as they cleaned up after dinner. What's it like? I've only been once, about 3 years ago. It's different from here, warmer, with more people. The coast is beautiful, all cliffs and ocean. The inland valleys are good for farming and ranching. Garrett poured them both more coffee from the pot. The rancher I'm meeting, his name is William Preston. He owns a large operation in the San Joaquin Valley. He's been buying horses from my family for years, and he specifically asked me to bring him some breeding stock. But you don't have horses with you now. No, I'll be selecting them from his current herd. He wants my opinion on which animals are worth keeping for breeding and which should be sold or trained for work. It's a consulting job, essentially. And you think he might have work for me? I know he will if I ask him. Preston is always looking for people who know horses and aren't afraid of hard work. You fit both criteria. Willa wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into her palms. It's strange, planning for a future. I've spent so long just trying to survive the present that I forgot what it was like to hope for something more. What did you hope for, before surviving took over? She considered the question carefully. I used to hope for a family, not necessarily a husband and children, though I wouldn't have minded that, but just people who cared whether I lived or died, a place where I mattered to someone. You matter to me, Garrett said quietly. Willa looked up, startled by the statement and the sincerity in his voice. We've only known each other a week. I know, but it's still true. He met her eyes across the fire. You matter to me, Willa Voss. Something in her chest tightened, a feeling so intense it was almost painful. She wanted to tell him that he mattered to her too, that in the span of a week he'd become more important to her than people she'd known for years. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by old fears and the certain knowledge that caring about someone meant giving them the power to hurt you. Instead, she said, I've never had someone say that to me before. Then people have been fools. Garrett stood and began banking the fire for the night. Get some rest. We have another long day tomorrow. Willa settled into her bedroll, but sleep was slow to come. She lay awake, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, and thinking about the way Garrett had looked at her when he said she mattered. She thought about his kindness, his patience, the way he'd given her his bed without question and protected her without asking for anything in return. She was falling for him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Despite all her defenses, despite years of learning not to trust or hope or want, she was falling for Garrett Xerxes, and that terrified her more than the Brennan brothers ever could. The journey continued, days bleeding into each other in a pattern of riding and camping, of careful vigilance and stolen moments of peace. They saw no more sign of the Brennan brothers, though Garrett never let his guard down completely. Willa found herself becoming a stronger rider, more confident in the saddle, able to read the land the way Garrett had taught her. They talked during the long hours on the trail, sharing stories and opinions, learning each other's thoughts and temperaments. Willa discovered that Garrett had a quiet sense of humor and a tendency to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Garrett learned that Willa was smarter than her lack of formal education suggested, with a quick mind and an observation that caught details others missed. At night, sitting by the fire, the conversations grew deeper and more personal. Garrett told her about his sister Emma, about the guilt he carried over not being there when she needed him. Willa shared her memories of her father, the complicated grief of mourning someone who'd made her life miserable, but was still the only parent she'd known. "Do you think people can change?" Willa asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset from a rocky outcropping. "Really change? I mean, not just pretend to be different for a while?" Garrett thought about it. "I think people can grow. They can learn from their mistakes and make better choices. But fundamentally change who they are? I'm not sure. Why do you ask?" "I've been thinking about my father, about whether he could have been different if circumstances had been different. If my mother had lived, maybe he would have been a good man. Or maybe he was always going to be the kind of person who blamed others for his own unhappiness. You can't spend your life wondering about maybes. Your father made his choices and they hurt you. That's on him, not on your mother dying or any other circumstance." "I know, but sometimes I wonder if I'm like him, if I have that same anger inside me, waiting to come out." Garrett turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "You're nothing like that, Willa. You've been hurt and scared and pushed to your limits, and you've never once taken it out on someone who didn't deserve it. That man who attacked you, he made his choice. You just refused to be his victim. That's not anger, that's survival. How can you be so sure? Because I've been watching you. I've seen how you treat the horses, gentle even when you're tired. I've seen how you thank people for the smallest kindness. I've seen how you worry about being a burden, even though you work twice as hard as necessary to pull your weight." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused. "You're a good person, Willa. Don't let your father's ghost convince you otherwise." Willa looked down at their joined hands, feeling that warmth spread through her entire body. "You have a lot of faith in people for someone who's seen the worst of them." "I choose to have faith. The alternative is becoming bitter and closed off. And I don't want to live that way." She squeezed his hand gently, then reluctantly pulled away. The physical contact felt dangerous, like standing too close to a fire. It would be so easy to lean into Garrett, to let herself depend on him completely. And she knew that way led to heartbreak. They continued on, crossing into California in late afternoon on what Garrett estimated was their 16th day of travel. The border was unmarked, just more sagebrush and rocky soil. But Garrett announced it with quiet satisfaction. "We made good time," he said. "Preston's ranch is still another week away, but we're through the worst of the territory." Willa felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that they'd made it this far without the Brennan brothers catching them. Disappointment that their journey was more than half over. Once they reached Preston's ranch, what happened then? Would Garrett help her find work and then leave, moving on to his next job, his next adventure? The thought of not seeing him every day sent an ache through her chest. They spent that night in the town of Alturas, California, splurging on a hotel room with 2 beds. It was a luxury after weeks of sleeping on the ground, and Willa savored every moment of it. The soft mattress, the clean sheets, the privacy of 4 walls. After they'd both bathed and changed into clean clothes, they went down to the hotel dining room for dinner. It was the first real meal they had had since leaving Pendleton, and Willa felt almost giddy with the simple pleasure of eating at a table with real plates and silverware. "You look happy," Garrett observed, watching her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I am happy. This is wonderful." She gestured at the plate of roast chicken and vegetables in front of her. "Real food, a real bed. It feels almost decadent." "You deserve decadent." Garrett's expression was soft, affectionate in a way that made Willa's heart skip. "You've handled this whole journey with more grace and strength than most people could manage." "I had a good traveling companion." She met his eyes, held his gaze. "Thank you, Garrett, for everything. You've already thanked me about 100 times. And I'll probably thank you 100 more before we reach Preston's ranch." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, then retired to their room. Willa claimed one of the beds, and Garrett took the other, maintaining the respectful distance he'd kept throughout their journey. But as Willa lay in the darkness, she found herself wishing he were closer, wishing she had the courage to cross the space between them and tell him what she was feeling. She must have made some sound, some indication of her restlessness, because Garrett's voice came softly through the dark. "You all right over there?" "Yes, no, I don't know." She sat up, pulling her knees to her chest. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why haven't you tried anything? I mean, we've been traveling together for weeks, sleeping near each other every night, and you've never once made any kind of advance. Why?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then she heard him sit up as well, the bed frame creaking slightly. "Because you've been hurt enough, Willa. You needed help and protection, not another man trying to take advantage of you. I wanted you to feel safe with me. I do feel safe with you. But that's not what I'm asking." "Then what are you asking?" Willa took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I'm asking if the only reason you haven't touched me is because you think you shouldn't, or if it's because you don't want to." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Then she heard Garrett get out of his bed, his footsteps crossing the floor. He stopped beside her bed, a dark shape in the darker room. "I've wanted to touch you since the first night in Pendleton," he said, his voice low and rough. "I've wanted to hold you, kiss you, tell you all the things I've been thinking and feeling, but I didn't want to scare you or make you feel obligated because I've been helping you." Willa reached out, finding his hand in the darkness. "You wouldn't be scaring me, and I don't feel obligated. I feel like maybe I'm falling for you, and I don't know what to do about it." Garrett's fingers tightened around hers. "Willa, I don't want to be something you regret." "How could I regret you? You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." She felt him sit on the edge of her bed, could sense him leaning closer even in the darkness. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of protecting myself from things that might hurt me. I want this. I want you." Garrett's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "I won't hurt you. I promise." "I know." He kissed her then, soft and careful, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Willa didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and kissed him back with all the longing and hope she'd been holding inside. The kiss deepened, grew more urgent, and Garrett's arms came around her, pulling her close. Willa felt like she was drowning and being saved at the same time, overwhelmed by sensation and emotion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I'm in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out like a confession. "I know it's too soon and probably foolish, but I can't help it. I'm in love with you, Willa Voss." Tears sprang to Willa's eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "I'm in love with you too. I've been fighting it because I was scared, but I can't fight it anymore." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, before Garrett gently laid her back on the bed and stretched out beside her, fully clothed, simply holding her. They didn't do anything more than kiss and whisper to each other in the darkness, learning the shape of this new thing between them. When morning came, Willa woke to find herself still in Garrett's arms, his body warm against hers, his breathing deep and even. She watched him sleep for a while, memorizing his face in the morning light, and thought that she'd never been happier than she was in this moment. They left Alturas after breakfast and continued their journey south. Something had shifted between them, a barrier removed, and they rode closer now, their hands brushing when they helped each other with the horses, their conversations more intimate and personal. The landscape continued to change as they traveled, becoming greener and more fertile as they approached the San Joaquin Valley. They passed through small towns and farming communities, staying in modest accommodations when they could, and camping when they couldn't. One evening, about a week after leaving Alturas, they crested a hill and saw Preston's ranch spread out in the valley below. It was impressive, with a large main house, multiple barns, and extensive corrals filled with horses. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and even from this distance, they could see people moving about their work. "That's it," Garrett said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "We made it." Willa should have felt relief, triumph even, but all she felt was a sudden, overwhelming fear. They'd arrived at their destination, which meant the journey was over. What happened now? Would Garrett complete his business and leave? Would she become just another person he'd helped along the way? A good deed done and then forgotten? As if sensing her thoughts, Garrett reached over and took her hand. We made it together. That's not going to change just because we reached our destination. What if it does? What if everything was just because of the journey, and now that it's over, you realize you don't actually want this? Garrett reined in his horse and turned to face her fully. Listen to me, Willa. I love you, not because of the journey, not because I felt obligated to help you, but because of who you are. That's not going to change, because we've reached California. How can you be sure? Because I'm not going anywhere without you. If you'll have me, I want us to build a life together, here, or wherever you want to go, but together. Willa felt tears spill down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. I want that too, more than anything. They rode down the hill together, hand in hand, toward the ranch and whatever future waited for them there. William Preston turned out to be a large man in his 50s with a booming laugh and a sharp eye for horses. He greeted Garrett like an old friend, pumping his hand enthusiastically and demanding to know about his journey. When Garrett introduced Willa as his future wife, Preston didn't bat an eye, just welcomed her with the same warmth. Any woman who can survive the trail with this one has to be special, Preston said, clapping Garrett on the shoulder. Come on, let me show you around and we'll talk business. They spent the next few days getting settled in. Preston offered them a small cottage on the property, recently vacated by a foreman who'd moved on, and insisted they take it for as long as they needed. Garrett began his work evaluating the horses, and Willa, true to her word, made herself useful around the stables. It quickly became apparent that Willa knew her way around horses as well as she'd claimed. Within a week, Preston had offered her a permanent position as one of his horse trainers, with a salary that made her eyes widen in disbelief. You've got a gift, Preston told her after watching her work with a particularly difficult colt. The horses respond to you. That's not something that can be taught. Life at the ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. Willa worked with the horses during the day. Garrett consulted with Preston on breeding and purchasing decisions, and in the evenings they retreated to their cottage, cooking dinner together and talking about their day. It was domestic in a way Willa had never experienced, and she found herself cherishing every mundane moment. One evening, about a month after their arrival, Garrett came home with a small velvet box in his pocket. They had just finished dinner when he pulled it out and set it on the table between them. I know we've talked about this, he said, suddenly nervous in a way Willa had never seen him. But I wanted to do it properly. Willa Voss, will you marry me? He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it was the most beautiful thing Willa had ever seen. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Preston serving as witness and a traveling preacher performing the service. Willa wore a dress that Preston's wife had insisted on buying for her, a beautiful blue silk that made her feel like a princess. Garrett wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes shining with love as he said his vows. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Garrett kissed her in front of God and everyone, Willa felt like her heart might burst from happiness. This was real. She was married to a man who loved her, had work that fulfilled her, and a home that was truly hers. It was everything she'd never dared to dream of. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous despite the months they'd spent growing closer. Garrett was patient and gentle, taking his time, making sure Willa felt loved and cherished. When they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like they'd been made to fit together exactly this way. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets of their bed, the bed that was now truly theirs, Garrett traced lazy patterns on Willa's shoulder and said, "Do you remember that first night in Pendleton, when I gave you my bed? How could I forget? It was the first time I'd ever slept in a real bed. I knew then, I think, not that I loved you, not yet, but that you were going to be important to me, that helping you was going to change my life." Willa turned in his arms so she could look at his face. "You saved my life, Garrett, in every way that matters. And you saved mine. I was drifting before I met you, going through the motions but not really living. You gave me purpose, a reason to be better." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and when morning came, Willa woke to find Garrett watching her with such love in his eyes that it took her breath away. The months that followed were the happiest of Willa's life. She thrived in her work, gaining a reputation as one of the best horse trainers in the valley. Garrett's consultations with Preston turned into a permanent partnership, and together they built up one of the finest horse breeding operations in California. They built a life filled with small joys and shared dreams. They took long rides through the valley on their days off, exploring the countryside and talking about the future. They hosted dinners for the ranch hands and other workers, Willa's cooking becoming legendary among the men. They wrote letters to Garrett's family in Washington, and eventually his parents came to visit, falling in love with Willa immediately. About a year after their marriage, Willa discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. She'd never known her own mother, had no template for what motherhood should look like, and she was terrified of failing at it. Garrett held her as she cried out her fears, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "You're going to be an amazing mother," he told her. "You have so much love to give, and this baby is going to be lucky to have you. What if I'm like my father? What if I resent the baby for changing our lives? That's not going to happen. You're nothing like your father, Willa. You're kind and patient and full of love. Our baby is going to grow up knowing they're wanted and cherished because that's who you are." The pregnancy was difficult at times, Willa's body adjusting to the changes while she tried to maintain her work with the horses. But Garrett was there for every moment, taking on extra responsibilities, rubbing her aching feet at night, holding her hair back when morning sickness hit. Their son was born on a warm spring evening in 1885, screaming his arrival to the world with impressive lungs. They named him Grant, and from the moment Willa held him in her arms, she knew that Garrett had been right. She loved this tiny person with a fierceness that surprised her, a protective instinct so strong it was almost frightening. Garrett was a natural father, patient and playful, staying up for nighttime feedings and diaper changes without complaint. Watching him with Grant, seeing the gentle way he cradled their son, made Willa fall in love with him all over again. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that included sleepless nights and endless laundry, but also moments of pure wonder. Grant's first smile, his first laugh, the way he reached for them with his tiny hands, all of it felt like miracles. When Grant was 6 months old, they received word that the Brennan brothers had been arrested in Idaho territory for attacking another woman. The news came via a letter from the sheriff in Pendleton, who'd been keeping an eye out for information about them. With 2 of the brothers in jail, and the third having died in a saloon fight, the threat that had driven Willa from Idaho was finally truly over. "It's over," Willa said, reading the letter for the 3rd time. "I'm really free." Garrett wrapped his arms around her from behind, careful not to disturb Grant, who was sleeping against her shoulder. "You've been free since the moment you defended yourself, but I'm glad they can't hurt anyone else now." Willa leaned back against him, savoring the warmth and security of his embrace. "Sometimes I think about that night in Pendleton, about how different my life would be if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't helped me. But I was there, and I'll always be here, Willa, for as long as you'll have me. Forever then. I'll have you forever." The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and joys. Grant grew into a curious, energetic toddler, and then a thoughtful boy who showed his mother's way with horses and his father's gentle temperament. 2 years after Grant's birth, they welcomed a daughter they named Grace, who had Willa's green eyes and Garrett's dark hair. Willa sometimes thought about the girl she'd been, running through the night with blood on her hands and terror in her heart. That girl had never slept in a real bed, had never known kindness without strings attached, had never dared to dream of a real home and family. And now, here she was, married to a man who loved her beyond measure, mother to 2 beautiful children, respected for her work, and secure in her place in the world. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised her with a trip to the coast. They left the children with Preston and his wife, who'd become like grandparents to Grant and Grace, and rode west until they reached the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. They stood together watching the waves crash against the rocks, and Willa thought about all the miles they'd traveled together, both literal and metaphorical. From that first night in Pendleton to this moment, hand in hand on the edge of the continent, it had been an incredible journey. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Garrett as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Giving up your wandering ways to settle down with me?" Garrett pulled her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "Not for a single second. You and our children, the life we've built together, it's everything I never knew I wanted. You're everything I never knew I needed." "I love you," Willa said, the words still carrying the weight and wonder they'd had that first night in Alturas. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I love you too, and you don't have to be scared anymore, Willa. We're safe. We're home. We're exactly where we're supposed to be." They stayed on the coast for 3 days, walking the beaches, exploring tide pools, talking about their dreams for the future. They wanted to expand the ranch, maybe purchase their own land eventually. They talked about whether they wanted more children, about how to ensure Grant and Grace grew up knowing they were loved and valued. They talked about growing old together, about becoming grandparents someday, about all the years that stretched out before them, like a promise. When they returned to the ranch, Grant and Grace ran to greet them, and Willa scooped them both up, one in each arm, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. This was her family. These were her people. This was the home she'd spent 19 years dreaming of and 10 years building. That night, after the children were asleep, Willa stood in the doorway of their bedroom, looking at the bed they shared. It was bigger now than that first bed in Pendleton, more comfortable, but it still represented everything that night had meant. Garrett had given her his bed without question, had taken the floor, had shown her that kindness existed in the world, and that single act had changed the entire trajectory of her life. Garrett came up behind her, following her gaze. "What are you thinking about?" "That night in Pendleton, the bed, how you didn't even hesitate to give it to me. I couldn't let you sleep on the floor, not when you'd never slept in a real bed before. That bed saved my life, not literally maybe, but in every way that really matters. It was the first time anyone had ever put my needs above their own. The first time I felt like I mattered." Garrett turned her in his arms, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You've always mattered. You always will. To me, to our children, to everyone whose life you've touched. You matter, Willa Xerxes." She kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into it, and he kissed her back with equal fervor. They moved to the bed together, their bed, and made love with the practiced ease of two people who knew each other's bodies as well as their own. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Willa thought about the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. She'd traveled so far, both literally and figuratively, and it had all started with a cowboy who'd given her his bed and taken the floor without question. The years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable changes that time brings. Grant grew into a fine young man who inherited the ranch from Preston when he retired, and Grace married a neighboring rancher and gave Willa and Garrett their first grandchildren. More grandchildren followed, and the little cottage they had started out in was eventually replaced by a larger house that could accommodate family gatherings. Through it all, through the good times and the hard times, the moments of joy and the moments of sorrow, Willa and Garrett remained each other's constant. They worked side by side, raised their children with love and wisdom, and built something that would last beyond their own lifetimes. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and tears, and through it all, Willa held Garrett's hand, marveling at how lucky she'd been. Later, when the party had wound down and most of the guests had gone home, their eldest grandson, a curious 12-year-old named Thomas, asked how they'd met. Willa and Garrett exchanged a look, silently communicating in the way that only people who'd spent 3 decades together could. Then Garrett squeezed her hand and said, "Why don't you tell him, love?" So Willa did. She told Thomas about running through the night, about collapsing in the streets of Pendleton, about a kind cowboy who'd given her his bed without question and taken the floor. She told him about the journey to California, about falling in love on the trail, about building a life from nothing but hope and hard work. Thomas listened with wide eyes, clearly entranced by the story. When she finished, he said, "So Grandpa saved you?" Willa looked at Garrett, at his weathered face and the gray in his hair, at the love still shining in his eyes after all these years, and smiled. "We saved each other," she said. "That's what people who love each other do." Garrett pulled her close, kissing the top of her head, and Willa closed her eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of him. She thought about that first bed, about the floor he'd taken without complaint, about how a single act of kindness had changed everything. She'd never slept in a real bed before that night in Pendleton. The cowboy had given her his and taken the floor without question, And in doing so, he'd given her so much more than a comfortable place to sleep. He'd given her hope, love, a future, a family, a home. He'd given her a life worth living. And she'd spent every day since then grateful beyond measure for that gift, and for the man who'd given it to her. As the sun set over the California valley, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple, Willa Xerxes stood surrounded by the family she and Garrett had built together, and knew that she was the luckiest woman in the world. She'd traveled a long, hard road to get here, but every step had been worth it. The journey that had started with a cowboy's kindness and a bed given freely had led her to this moment, this place, this life, and she wouldn't change a single thing about it.